Hey everybody, welcome back to Chapter 18. We're in the second lecture for Chapter 18, and we're going to talk about hemopoiesis and what happens. So, the hematopoietic system of bone marrow is the proliferation of a hemopoietic stem cell or a hemocytoblast into all the different blood cells that we have. So we start out with this multipotent stem cell that can turn into any type of blood cell. So it is a blood cell stem cell, but it can be any, it can turn into any blood cell. So we always are producing blood. So when this hematopoietic cell undergoes mitosis, it produces one stem cell that will undergo differentiation and another cell that becomes the hematopoietic stem cell again. So we never lose these stem cells that can produce any of the blood. So this cell here is going to differentiate either into a myeloid stem cell or a lymphoid stem cell, depending on what the body needs at the time. So if we look at the myeloid stem cell line, myeloid stem cells are going to differentiate into the proerythroblast, which produces your red blood cells, the myeloblast, which produces all of your white blood cell fills. So there's your basophil, your neutrophil, and your eosinophil. So these are all granulocytes here. A monoblast produces the monocyte, and a megakaryoblast will differentiate into a megakaryocyte, which then produces the platelets. If we go down the lymphoid stem cell line, we have a lymphoblast that will then differentiate into either lymphocytes, B and T lymphocytes, or natural killer cells. And so this is a really nice table that kind of gives a summary of all of the different types of cells. So red blood cells, it tells you how many blood cells we have, most common type of cell in the body, in our blood plasma. And then we look down here, so this is all the white blood cells, but we can separate them out looking at neutrophils and how many are here, eosinophils, basophils, the agranulocytes, including your lymphocytes and your monocytes. And so you can see which ones are really common up here and even here compared to those that are super uncommon like basophils or eosinophils. Then you have how do those cells appear? So you can kind of read, you can also look at the pictures. What are their functions and any extra comments that you have that the textbook has about them. So this is kind of a nice table just to summarize everything. Down at the bottom we have platelets. Platelets aren't your white blood cells or erythrocytes, they're the pieces of a megakaryocyte. So we're going to look at the red blood cells first, and then we'll talk about white blood cells, and then we'll talk about platelets, okay? So erythrocytes are your red blood cells. These are the most common of all of the blood cells that we have. They are biconcave discs. What they always remind me of is a donut where the center was not punched out. You know how donuts have those little center area that are usually punched out? Instead, they were just flattened in the center. So it's like this disc that looks kind of like maybe a Frisbee too, that has the center that's flattened in. Males have a little bit more red blood cells than females, mainly because males tend to be larger than females. Red blood cells contain hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a quaternary protein. So quaternary proteins are proteins that have multiple chains associated with them. So instead of just having one polypeptide fold up into its functional form, this protein has 4 polypeptides that fold up all together, forming the hemoglobin molecule. And then within that hemoglobin molecule, an iron binding ring is attached. So there's a heme moiety there. That iron binding ring is very important. That's what binds oxygen. So every hemoglobin molecule can bind up to 4 oxygen molecules. So there are 4 heme moieties. You see there, and there. So these are where oxygen can bind. And in one blood cell, you can have, millions, like up to 300 million hemoglobin molecules. And so 300 million hemoglobin molecules, and each hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 oxygen. So you can, in one blood cell, one single blood cell, you're going to have more than 1 billion oxygen molecules. So that's a lot of oxygen that our body is holding on to. We need oxygen for energy production. So that's why we need all this oxygen in our system, so that we can drive all the activity that our body does. So how is erythrocyte production, or how does erythrocyte production occur? This figure actually comes from a different textbook that I've used in the past. It's from a Saladin textbook. It's figure 18.8. It is probably the best figure that I've ever seen in describing the negative feedback mechanism of blood cell production, of red blood cell production. So when we have low oxygen levels, that is when red blood cell production is going to increase. So let's look at it. Why do we have low oxygen levels? Maybe because we're exercising, and so we need more oxygen. Maybe because we're ill. We have an illness. Maybe we have a cold, and so we're not getting as much oxygen in. Maybe we've had a severe asthma attack. Whatever the cause, we have low oxygen levels. This is going to be identified by mainly the kidneys, but the liver can also identify some low oxygen levels, because blood does move through the liver when we are sending nutrients to the liver and stuff. But the kidneys are constantly filtering our blood. And so the kidneys produce, or the kidneys, when they filter the blood, they recognize low oxygen levels, and they produce a hormone in response called erythropoietin. Erythropoietin enters, and so again, here we have an organ that's of the urinary system, and it is functioning as an endocrine structure. So I told you a lot of our organs that are non-endocrine can still have some endocrine function. Erythropoietin is released into the blood, and it moves to our red bone marrow. Red bone marrow is where we have those hemocytoblasts, those stem cells, multipotent stem cells for blood cell production. That's going to stimulate erythropoiesis, or red blood cell production. So erythropoiesis starts, and we're going to increase the amount of blood cells, which increases the amount of oxygen carrying capacity, which brings our body back into homeostasis. Erythrocytes don't last very long, though. So they can live, the maximum lifespan is about 120 days. Most erythrocytes probably don't live that long, but they can live that long. Erythrocytes don't live that long because they don't have the organelles to fix them. So let's look at this picture, and I'll walk you through what their life is kind of like. So once hemopoiesis occurs, Then we have in the red bone marrow, we have stem cells that become myeloid stem cells. Those myeloid stem cells are going to differentiate into erythroblasts in the presence of erythropoietin. Erythroblasts will eventually become reticulocytes, which are immature blood cells, but they enter the bloodstream. So these immature red blood cells will maturate and circulate for up to about 120 days. If or during their maturation process, the reticulocytes they form the hemoglobin. As they're forming hemoglobin and producing so much hemoglobin, they have to make room for all the hemoglobin, so they start degenerating some of their organs, organelles. And eventually the organelles and even the nucleus is degraded. And so a red blood cell then is going to have very little, it's pretty much a bag of hemoglobin that moves through our system. Once it has reached its lifespan, so its maximum lifespan, or when it is too damaged, they are going to be phagocytized by macrophages, either in bone marrow or the liver or in the spleen. So once that happens, once phagocytosis occurs, they're breaking up the blood and they produce or they separate the heme portion from the globin portion. The globin is the protein. The heme portion of the erythrocyte is going to be sent to the liver. So here we have that heme group here. This heme group of the hemoglobin. The heme is going to be separated into biliverdin and then the iron ion. Iron ions and the biliverdin can both move into the liver, where they are then stored and can be used to produce new hemoglobin molecules, or they're going to be released in either urine or feces. The globin portion is then going to be broken down into individual amino acids, which then can be used to produce new hemoglobin molecules or other molecules, depending on what our body needs at the time. So I wonder how many of you have ever heard of blood doping. Blood doping is a mechanism that's often used by athletes to increase their performance or enhance their performance. What they're doing, so red blood cells carry oxygen. Oxygen is what we need for ATP or energy production. So what we need for athletes, or what athletes need, is a lot of energy, a lot of ATP production so that they can do work really well. Makes sense? And so blood doping occurs when a person takes in extra red blood cells. So maybe and I'm just making this up, in January, a person donates red blood cells to themselves. So they basically go through the process of giving blood, but that blood is then stored for when they need it. So they take out, half a liter or a liter of blood. They then their erythropoietin, their oxygen levels will decrease, so erythropoietin will be produced, and they will start forming new blood to build up their blood supply again. Then, say 6 months later, they are going to have a race, or they're going to have a game where they have to perform really well. They then can donate the blood that they gave back to themselves. So they basically take in that blood, it's their blood, and now they have, instead of 6 liters of blood or 5 liters of blood, with 45% of that blood being red blood cells, they now have an extra liter of red blood cells. Make sense? So it's and so when they do this, they're not getting the plasma, they're only getting the red blood cells. So it's making their blood a lot thicker as well. This allows them to work harder because they have more oxygen, so more ATP production, but it's considered illegal. So it is banned, and people have been, well, denied different trophies because they blood doped. Another form of blood doping occurs when they use erythropoietin, pharmaceutical erythropoietin, to increase blood cell production. So why is it legal? Why is it illegal? Because it's not fair to others. I mean, that's kind of the whole, you're working hard to get, some title. Someone else who is working hard but then gives themselves a boost, like extra oxygen, shouldn't be allowed to do that. Everybody should be on the same page. It also is illegal because it's really dangerous. So it thickens your blood. I told you that you're only getting the blood cells, so your blood is going to be thicker. Thicker blood is harder to pump, and that means that your heart's going to have to work a lot harder. It can cause cardiovascular damage, and it can cause death. So it's really dangerous. Some disorders associated with blood. The most common is anemia. So anemia is occurs when you have lower oxygen levels in the blood. So oftentimes this is because you have less blood in your system. So it might be because you have had a lot of blood lost. So think of a female during her menses. If they lose a lot of blood, they might become anemic for a time. And this can lead to lethargy because you don't have the ATP again. You may not be able to take in as much oxygen as normal because you don't have those blood cells functioning properly. It can also cause your heart not to work as effectively. So why does this occur? I told you heavy blood loss. If you don't have, if you can't produce the erythrocytes, or if erythrocyte production is abnormal, or if you can't produce the hemoglobin because you don't have enough iron, if you don't have the vitamins that you need to produce blood cells, or there could be genetic factors. So here we have a picture, probably the most common that we see here is iron deficiency anemia. A lot of people are iron deficient. They don't get enough iron, and so they have to take in extra iron. And in that form, you're not producing the hemoglobin, so you can't carry as much oxygen. Hemorrhagic is when you're bleeding out. Let me see if I have a picture of that. Hold on. Yep. Okay. This is hemolytic, not hemorrhagic, sorry. Hemolytic anemia is when your blood cells are bursting inside of your system. And so do you see these little yellow things? So these yellow structures are actually protozoans. They're called plasmodium protozoans, and these ones cause a disease known as malaria. And one of the major functions that these protozoans do is they go through a process called schizani, where they are undergoing mitosis very, very rapidly. So instead of just one single mitotic split, they split like into 8 or 10 cells. And so they fill up those red blood cells really fast, and then they have to get out of those blood cells so they can get into another mosquito. And when they do that, they cause the blood cells to break open, and that's known as hemolysis. Okay, here we have sickle cell anemia. So sickle cell anemia occurs when you have, it's a genetic disorder, and it occurs when the 6th amino acid has a single point mutation. So glutamate is supposed to be there, but when we change one nucleotide, it changes the amino acid that was put in, and valine is the only difference. So this is the only amino acid difference, but it causes the protein to form or to fold up differently. And it leads to this sickle-shaped cell here. And this sickle-shaped cell can't hold oxygen properly. It also can get stuck in our blood vessels, and so it's very dangerous. Oh, hold on. Okay. The last one I want to talk about just quickly before I go to the next slide is hemorrhagic anemia, just so that you know. Hemorrhagic anemia is anemia associated with bleeding out, which I had mentioned before. So going back to sickle cell anemia, it's caused by one point mutation in the 6th amino acid. And so this figure shows what those sickle-shaped cells look like. This is from your textbook, and so I wanted to keep this in there because you can really see those normal cells, and then you see the sickle-shaped cell here. Another disorder is polycythemia. Polycythemia is an abnormally high percentage of red blood cells. So just like blood doping, with polycythemia, you have extra red blood cells. This can actually put more stress on your heart again. So there are different reasons for you to be polycythemic. So one example would be a natural example would be environmental change. So if you live in an environment where oxygen is harder to get into your system, so think about moving up in, instead of living at sea level, we move up higher. The higher in the atmosphere that we move, the lower or the less pressure there is. And that can cause it to be harder for you to get oxygen. And so people who live high up in mountains tend to be polycythemic to get the amount of oxygen they need. But another form, a dangerous form, is unregulated erythrocyte growth, often associated with different types of cancer. So in that type of polycythemia, it's polycythemia vera, you have high levels of erythrocytes to the point where you're going to have to go in and have your blood taken out so that your blood can function normally. So they're going to be taking out lots and lots of red blood cells just so that your blood thins out enough so you can function normally. All right, I'm going to stop here. This is a little bit longer than the last one. And in our next lecture, we'll start on those leukocytes. Bye.